me kind of bothersome? Because I can turn, I don't know.
That is lovely, but the other way was lovely too.
Fine. All right. It's just, maybe I'll put the shade down a little bit more.
I think it's fun that you, there is an element to Zoom that is fun because you do get a glimpse of home offices.
Okay.
I enjoy Zoom because you do get a glimpse into people's home office or, workspace or whatever. I am lucky to have a studio at Nasco that is, set lovely. I'm giggling because, let's see which way do I move? They were doing a little bit of some yoga stuff. So you can see some yoga mats in the back, but I thought, I don't know, you know what? Mindfulness right now is right at the top of everybody's agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. When the fall after the pandemic started, everything shut down in March, the following fall, that cohort of students that I had, they were such good sports about doing things on Zoom. And one of my students is an accordion player. So
oh my gosh.
She often would start our class and I said, Katrina, play us a tune, get us started.
That is amazing. Welcome to everybody who is logging on. It's 3:59. So I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to get on. And I think we'll start right away at 4:01. But looks like we have quite a few people logging on already. Please type your name and what grade level you teach. If you have any questions ahead of time, I know that's funny to ask because you don't necessarily know all the information that's going to be presented, but it's going to be fabulous. And we absolutely want you to participate. So.
And just in case, my dog might growl while I'm presenting, so I'll just.
I'm all good with growl. Oh, so cute. That's like a movie dog.
It's getting close to her dinner time, so she gets a little feisty and like a little bully. So
that is okay. Well, good. Oh my gosh, we've got people from Dallas, Georgia. I was going to say Texas, but I saw a GA behind it, and just lots of, we've got some middle school, we've got some high school, we've got some elementary. So this is fantastic. North Carolina, and it's 4 o'clock. So we'll just wait a few more minutes. We've got about 30 people on already. You guys are going to just love this so much. Oh, good. California is joining us. Lenore, I'm always worried because it's so hard to get East Coast and West Coast at a time that works for everybody. So I'm glad you're able to join. Jehan from Oshkosh, Wisconsin is on. And
I know Jehan was my old colleague. So hi, Jehan.
Yes. Also a wonderful workshop with his students at Wisconsin Art Ed. And so, yeah, Nasco is definitely going to have to get Jehan to be a presenter sometime too. All right, everybody, it is 4:01. Welcome to Maker Monday. I am Chris Bakke. I am Customer Engagement Manager here at Nasco, and always so proud to be in front of art teachers, even if it is Zoom. Today, I have Dr. Mary Hoefferle, and I went to this workshop at the Wisconsin Art Education Association Fall Conference. I was an attendee. Nasco has not been traveling because of the COVID situation, but since it was in Wisconsin and we were masked and it was, we had some strict rules, but I begged and I got to go, and I'm so thrilled because I got to go to a bunch of amazing workshops, and Mary's was one of them. So let me just give you a little bit of background on Mary. Mary taught art to middle school students in Eau Claire, Wisconsin for 6 years. I feel like Eau Claire is just real rich with art education. Then she earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction from the UW-Madison Art Education emphasis with a minor in folklore. And I would love to talk to you about that because that sounds so interesting. She taught 5 years as an assistant professor at the UW Oshkosh and currently directs the Undergraduate Art Education program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's been happily teaching art education methods courses, supervising student teachers, collaborating with cooperating teachers, and conducting and development and evaluation at the UW for the last 8 years. She lives in a little condo with her sweetie Michael and dog Stella, who we just saw, and lots of houseplants. Since she was born and raised in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you may detect her Yooper accent during the presentation this evening. Dr. Mary, thank you so much for being here and all the research and time that you spent in this. Thank you for being so willing to share it with us freely. And I will let you completely take over the stage from here, and I will do a good job of monitoring questions, and feel free to type in while Dr. Mary is speaking, and then we'll definitely have some time at the end. And with any luck, I might be able to unmute all of you. So with that, Dr. Mary, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you. And thanks everybody from across the USA joining us. And I appreciate your virtual presence and your interest in this topic. And the title of my talk with you tonight is Freedom and Constraint in Art Education. And I think all of us are trying to balance our own and our students' freedom and the constraints in the classroom. And so, it's necessary. We need both for individual, collective, and creative flourishing. So that's the topic we're going to dive into. And I have some slides, and let's see, Chris, you'll need to give me access for screen sharing. And I just have a handful of slides that'll guide my part of the presentation. But any questions you have or comments, put them in the chat, as Chris said, and we will.
Gotta find you, Mary. There we go. I'm giggling because you should have them, but I am just going to change and momentarily make you the host.
Okay, that should work. All right, thanks.
We figure it out, don't we?
Yes. Okay. Just let me move some stuff around here. Okay, so load this up. So like Chris said, I gave a very similar presentation to this at the Wisconsin Art Ed Association conference, and I had to video record it as part of that conference. So I have a link to a YouTube video that if you find anything in my presentation today that you'd like to share with your colleagues, this video, YouTube video, will be there for your reference. So it's just loading. I don't know why it's so slow.
No worries.
Close out of that for a moment.
I learned so much, and it's interesting as somebody who has been lucky enough to go into lots of different classes and hear people talk about choice-based art and teacher-directed art. And it's funny because like that one didn't necessarily have a name to it because it was just sort of like teaching art, but choice-based art has a couple different names, and I know you're going to talk about that. And so I developed sort of my own perception of it. Coming to this workshop really put it into perspective. And I just thought, wow, this is just information everybody that is interested in choice-based or is at all concerned in terms of like what they do. It's just, to me, I thought it just really brought it together. So yay, and I will mute and let.
That was great, Chris. You filled in the space there while I figured out. Okay, so here's my email. If you have any questions as follow-up, I would welcome a message from you. Here's the YouTube link, and I am going to, Chris has the PDF of these slides, and I'll also add it to the chat in a little bit so that you have, you can access these slides. All right, so I wanted to tell you first the inspiration for this presentation, and it is related to what Chris was talking about. I've just seen more and more teachers interested in and also interested in moving their teaching practice toward choice-based models of art education. And I've just been really curious about why teachers are doing that now. TAB has been around for a while, but it's just really been in the last, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years that I see more teachers in the Madison area exploring TAB models. And just, if they're not using TAB, they're using language of like, I just want to figure out more choice in the art classroom. So I'm curious about what's driving their interest in that. And I haven't done like extensive research, like surveying teachers or going observe their classrooms around these questions. I'm just thinking about it right now and observing and trying to make sense of this for myself. So that's the primary inspiration for this topic. The other is this book that I read last summer, and it was published in 2018, but I just thought it was so interesting, and I thought that it had applicability to art education. So the author, Michelle Gelfand, studied in probably 50 different countries. She's looking for patterns across cultures. So she's a cross-cultural psychologist. And one finding of the book is that she and her research team found that cultures or groups of people tend to lean toward either really loose, not necessarily really loose, but loose or tight adherence to social norms. So she found that pattern among groups of people. And she hypothesized that the reason they're either loose or tight has to do with perceived or real threats. So I don't want to get too much into the depths of the book. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of things that I thought were really have utility in our profession. So a loose culture would be, the United States would be considered a loose culture because we have more flexibility around whether to follow a social norm or to reject it. A tight culture would be more like Singapore or Japan, where there's a much more conformity, much more adherence to the social norms. So what she discovered, these are some characteristics of loose and tight. She found that loose cultures, and she is very ready to say that the United States is a massive country. So different parts of the states are loose and some are tighter. But in general, she finds that in loose cultures, there's much greater tolerance of diversity, and they're much more multicultural than tight cultures. So if you've ever traveled to Japan, it's pretty homogenous. So loose cultures tend to tolerate diversity and be more multicultural. There's more freedom of speech. They tend to be more creative and innovative. And that was what made me think like, well, this definitely will have relationship to art education. If in a looser culture, if it cultivates creativity and innovation, then as art teachers, we should pay attention to that. Also, in loose cultures, we tend to be open to change and to new ideas, which is also really important for the arts. We tend to be more independent and self-directed, also really important for the arts. But there are also some trade-offs. And I want to emphasize that she makes this point many times in her book. If you want to just listen to a podcast with interviews with her, just Google her name. There's some really good interviews with her. But she said that loose or tight, one is not better than the other. There are trade-offs. The only time there are problems is if you're too loose or too tight. And so the trade-offs in the loose culture is we tend to have troubles with self-regulation, more crime, more obesity, more gambling, more drug abuse. So anything that requires self-regulation, we have more issues with that in looser cultures. And also too much choice, too much freedom can overwhelm and paralyze and lead to restlessness, anxiety, or a yearning for just something to stay the same, some security. So there's a trade-off with adhering to more of a loose adherence to social norms. So in tight cultures, they tend to be more orderly and more organized. We also need that in our classrooms. They tend to have great respect for convention and tradition. So not throwing everything out and let's have a revolutionary classroom. It's more of let's respect tradition and what's working in tradition. They tend to be more self-restrained, stable, predictable. As you can see, these are gross generalizations, but it's a lens. If you look at loose and tight as a lens, that can be useful for finding patterns. And other patterns in tight cultures, coordination is much easier due to enhanced group cohesion. So Michelle Gelfand, the author of this book, was called upon a lot during the pandemic because she was closely tracking how loose and tight cultures responded to the pandemic. And tight cultures had no problem with making mask mandates and everybody following the rule. With looser cultures, we have a much more diverse response to that. There's certainly less crime in tight cultures, but there's much more surveillance. So in the United States, we really honor our privacy. And so in tight cultures, that's one of the trade-offs. It may be safer, but there's more surveillance. And there's definitely a pressure to conform and downplay individuality and uniqueness. So that can be problematic in the arts. And then another trade-off is they tend to be more ethnocentric. So in showing it dualistically like this, like I said, it's not a clean model, but there's some really interesting things when you take that lens and you use the lens to look at other phenomenon, you might find some surprises. And ever since I read that book, I've looked at all kinds of things through a tight and loose lens, like parenting, if you're too tight or too loose, or our political ideologies, too tight, too loose. You know, and our political parties are tight and loose on different issues. So it's really interesting. But I'm going to move on to, well, let's look at loose and tight in relationship to art ed. So how can we use this concept in our teaching? And I'm just from now on going to use freedom and constraint instead of tight and loose, because I think those terms have more utility and applicability in art education. And if you use the lens of freedom and constraint to analyze your curriculum decisions, your instructional practices, your class dynamics, it might be useful in helping you identify what is or is not working well for you or your students. So in some ways, it's a diagnostic tool for problem finding and then problem solving. So in some ways, the lens helps, just like a microscope, it helps you notice something that you didn't notice before. So that's the hope. And these are guiding questions that I think might help as we go through this presentation that I found useful in getting my own students to think about the choices they're making in their teaching. So, you know, when and where are you giving students freedom right now in their projects, in their classroom behavior? When do they just get to choose what to do? But I think this question is even more important. Why are you giving students that freedom? What's the rationale behind your choices? And then this is also equally important question. What modeling, scaffolding, or practice do your students need in order to take advantage of the freedom you're giving? Because as you know, if you've been dabbling with choice, just giving more choice doesn't mean creative results, because sometimes students will do what they feel safe doing, or they just simply will sit there and not know what to do. Or they'll dabble and never really develop something. So this is a really important question of what kind of scaffolding do they need in order to really shoulder the responsibility of freedom. And then same with constraint, when and where are you imposing constraints in your curriculum? And why are you doing it? Are you making these imposing constraints because you feel better and more in control, or is the constraints useful for student learning? So that's the last question. How do constraints aid the learning process? Because if you think about it, every single artist imposes their own constraints on their creative process. Like Fred Stonehouse is one of our painting professors. He's a painter. That's what he's going to use. That's his constraint. He paints. And he has a limited subject matter. That's the subject he wants to explore. So all artists have constraints, and then they push against them. And that's part of their creative process. So I thought that would be helpful for you to just give some thought to these questions, as inventory, like what am I already doing? And do I have a reason for doing it? All right, so this first chunk, I'm just going to look at some issues of freedom and constraint in curriculum. So what are we teaching, and instructional practices of how we're teaching. So some of you may have seen from the Art of Education website, you may have seen their graphic that says the continuum of choice. I think that's what it's called. So I took some ideas from that graphic, but on one end of the spectrum is a teacher-directed curriculum where you give students limited choice, and there are more teacher-imposed constraints than on this end of the spectrum, where students are given abundant choice and there's more freedom, more student selections, and then everything else in between. So you've certainly seen projects like this. Maybe I should use my little annotation thing. Maybe that'll help. Oh, never mind. I'll just use my pointer. So with projects like this, when I see things like this in the schools, just looking at it, it was a teacher-directed project. There's no doubt about it, because students had they didn't have any choice at all. If you're teaching every little sweetie in your class here to paint 3 sunflowers, you've made every decision for them. And so my question would be, why are you teaching this? And you might say, well, I want them to develop craft. It would probably meet that goal. So you have to think about what is the learning goal and what teaching strategy will work. But I heard lots of arguments, well, you can still teach craft and give students choice, because artists come up with their own ideas. But I would also argue that lots of artists started by copying other artists. That's an age-old way to learn how to do something. So, and then of course, projects like this where each student gets a little square and has to recreate the masterpiece. So the question, like I'm going to come back to this many times, is what are your learning goals? And then that should drive how much freedom you give students. So this is where I find most teachers land on this continuum right now. They're landing in a space where they choose the specific genre, like in this cityscape. They decide every 4th grader is going to make a cityscape, and we're going to use collage. But within that, there is choice. Students can decide what the building shapes look like, how many buildings, what kind of details. And when you teach a project like this, then you can teach other concepts like foreground, middle ground, background. It can be relate to professional artists' work and their exploration of cityscapes. So that has a little more choice than this one. And the same with mugs like this. If you really need your students to know how to throw a mug on the wheel, they have to learn that skill. And then there's some freedom with the form. And then when we move into a little bit more choice, this is, it's each time you give more choice to students, they will be encountering more problems to solve. So you're setting up more problems for them to encounter and then to work through, because you haven't figured out all the problems, because it totally depends on some of their choices. So in this level of choice and freedom, a teacher might give an artistic prompt like create a 3D paper mache imaginary creature. And then it needs to be designed to be displayed in a specific place and in a specific way. So you want everybody to learn this media, but then what they make and how it functions. Is it going to function as a sculpture? Will it be a mask? Will it be a mobile? How will you display it? Who will it be for? All of those are decisions that you are putting on the student, and it can be really exciting for them to have that much open-endedness, but it's still structured. There's still constraints. And then on this end of the spectrum is more of what we might see like in an elementary tab classroom, where the student gets to decide what their art or design work will be, what will it be used for, and how it functions. So you might have two students sitting right next to each other in the construction studio or center, and one student's making this cool little castle and the other student's making some jewelry. So they're totally open-ended, and students are taking their ideas in different directions. But just like with the loose and tight book, there are trade-offs. When you decide to embrace a much more open classroom, you're just going to have to make different choices that will have different results. And with my students, I just say, have a good reason for the choices you're making. Make a case for it. Okay, similar to this continuum, I also have just another example with paper sculpture. So of course, if you have all your first graders making paper flowers like this, and that's the end of the project, then students have learned how to do one thing. That can be a helpful start. It gives you a chance to do some assessment. Can all the students handle these materials? And then some teachers just stop there. That's the end of the project. But I could imagine that you might start in one unit, do all of these things on this slide. You might start with something more teacher directed just to get students familiar with the materials. And then maybe you introduce more paper sculpture techniques, give a few demos, and then let them decide which paper sculpture techniques to create a hat. So there's more choice here, and then even more choice. Maybe the third project in the unit is, now that I've taught you several things and you've practiced it, now you choose. What do you want to make? And you could have a whole set of slides or laminated images of ideas of things students could make as a way to scaffold their choice. So this is just like I said, I think sometimes, and Chris and I were talking right before all of you popped on, that some teachers think you either have to embrace a full pure choice classroom, or if you don't do that, then it's teacher directed. But I feel like there's so much room for movement with each group of grade level, and even asking what's developmentally appropriate. You could even reverse this order. Like, what if you started with this end where they're just experimenting? Here are strips of paper, see what you can make with it, and then move them into more sophisticated ways of working with that material. Okay. I wish we were together so that I could stop and you could turn to your group and share what's on your mind. But with this format, I'll just keep going for a few more slides, and then we'll see what questions you have or ideas to share. So these are some other considerations I thought of in terms of freedom and constraint in the classroom. We usually want to teach art terminology and art vocabulary. So in a teacher-directed lesson or curriculum, the teacher's pre-identifying what those terms are, and then make sure students practice them and you teach them in different ways. But in a choice-based classroom, I noticed that teachers just listen in and they observe what students are making. And then they might say, oh, I've noticed that in your monoprint, you've made a symmetrical design. Do you know what symmetrical balance is? And so the vocabulary emerges from what students are creating. And then somewhere in between, the teacher might pre-identify some vocab, but then really attends to the emergence of new vocabulary. And then maybe they have a running vocab word wall or something in their classroom. We also see freedom and constraint in how artwork is presented. I don't know about you, but when I first started teaching middle school, I made every single decision about presentation. I decided what work would go up, where it would go, how it would be displayed. So there has to be some, and there's certainly times when that's just necessary because of practicality. But what if the teacher gives students options for if, how, when, and where they want to display their work? Or what if students choose all of those things, whereas this is more negotiated? So you can see with almost everything we do in the classroom, it can land on a continuum of freedom, total freedom, or way total constraint. And the same with deadlines. Are you making all the deadlines? Is it negotiated, or do students determine how long they want to work on something and when to turn it in? The last thing I thought of with curriculum instruction is, how often do we give students choice about when to work together? Usually the teacher's deciding, yep, this is a collaborative project, or no, it isn't. And that's it. But what if you made that always an option to work with a partner if you want to build something together or make something together? So that may happen more in a tab classroom. And let's see. So this is my main takeaway, is whatever decisions you're making about curriculum and instruction, it should be driven by your learning goals. Because if your learning goals are, I really want my students to be able to generate original ideas, then if that's the goal, then you have to provide lots of choice. But maybe there is a structure that needs to be in place first for scaffolding in order to help them with that. All right, the last couple of slides here. Of course, with classroom management, that piece of our jobs as art teachers, there's all kinds of decisions we make about how tight or loose to be with our students around expected behaviors. So these are just a handful of things that you have to make decisions about. Do you allow students to sit wherever they want? And if not, why not? And if there's a seating arrangement, then you probably have good reason for that. The same with movement in the classroom. Can they get up and move anytime they want to? Can they sit next to friends? Can they get up and pull on your sleeve to say, I want you to look at my artwork? So you have to make decisions about all of those things. And if you struggle with classroom management, it might be because you have too many freedoms and the students aren't ready for it. And if I've been in some classrooms that are also too constrained, everything's calm and quiet and the kids are all on task. It's very calm, but it tends to relate to the curriculum too, where the curriculum is very constrained. So the kids are making all of these cookie cutter works of art, and that can be problematic. So finding that balance is really it's tricky, and it's an ongoing challenge. And the last thing I wanted you to think about is, where do you have freedom and where are there constraints in your job? And I find that for art teachers, we have incredible freedom with curriculum. We get to make almost all of the decisions. And that is wonderful, but it can be overwhelming. There's a trade-off. And it can be very, and I only say this from working with first-year teachers, they can be so totally overwhelmed because they're figuring it all out for themselves. On the other hand, nobody wants to be given a big fat binder with, here are all the projects you're going to teach, and you got to teach them in this order. Although I've never heard of that happening. But so how much freedom do you have in your curriculum, and is that useful to you? Sometimes we have to put in our own rules. We have to put in our own constraints around curriculum so that we can manage it. The same with our models of art ed that we use to drive our decisions. If you want to be a community-based art ed program, you can be that. If you want a choice-based program, you can make those decisions. So we have so much more freedom than most other teachers. And so it's really, I love that part of working in the arts, but we also need some constraints. It can be overwhelming to have too much choice. Also thinking about, do you have any choice with your report cards and what language is used? Sometimes we are just, here it is. You have to use the structure which we're given and have to figure out how to make that work for our students and our projects. Also, how much freedom do you have with your schedule? Most of us have zero freedom schedules, extra duties, and professional development. How much freedom do you have to decide how you want to pursue professional development? Some districts are wonderful. They give you a lot of choice. And then other districts are like, here are the PD days, and we already have it all planned out for you. And in fact, it has nothing to do with art. I'm sure all of you have had that experience. So this freedom and constraint lens, we can use it to look at every part of art ed and then figure out, well, where can I make more freedom for myself if it has to do with professional development? Or where do I need to put in some constraints just for my own sanity, like with curriculum? I just observed an student teacher an hour ago, and she's working with a cooperating teacher who has to develop 9 grade levels of curriculum. And those of you working in rural areas know exactly what that's all about. It's a lot. And so how do you begin to structure curriculum development so that you can stay sane and it's a sustainable job? So, okay. So I want to pose this question to you, and hopefully you can put some of your thoughts in the chat or post your questions. And what ways do freedom and constraint shape the work that you do in your classroom or in your work as an artist? Because, like I said, artists, we are usually deciding our own constraints within our work, and that helps us, give us something to push against for creative response. So I will stop there and see what kind of questions we have. And what do you got for me, Chris?
So I actually do have a lot, and there is the little hand raiser if you want to raise your hand. Otherwise, I can attempt to let everybody, like if I create everybody as a panelist, I don't know if I can do it in a one fell swoop or not, but so here is a question. Unfortunately, I think time, space, and materials shape my choices too often. And another person says, yes, this is always a big factor.
Mm-hmm. Those are your constraints for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's true for almost everything with time and money. They constrain a lot of things. Um, yeah, and so those are your creative constraints. Like I have to work within these, and sometimes it's just the lens. Like I can see it as a constraint, but I can also see it as some, like, all right, all of us had to do that during the pandemic. Well, here's the constraint. I have Zoom. That's what I can do.
Yes.
And I totally understand that there's a certain point. It's like, I don't know how to be more creative with this, but think about what you can do just with like comics. There's endless variations of drawings you can do with comics. And Linda Berry is one of my colleagues, and she has wonderful resources of just endless prompts for comics making. So that's all you need, a pencil and paper. So there's lots of possibility within that one art form that can be mined. So, but I hear you. We all have those constraints and some so oppressive. Sometimes the schedules are so oppressive that I just want to shake the principal. I'm like, what? How do you expect really good art ed to happen under these conditions? So wherever you can advocate for yourself or get other people to advocate for you, that certainly will help.
I liked also what you talked about in terms of when there's freedom, there often becomes more opportunity to do problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting because, and you know, I'm not an art educator. I like to pretend I am, though, just for the record. But hanging out with all of you and being somebody that is often on your end, Mary, with observing, you know, I feel like my perception was that teacher directed was sometimes like look negatively and choice based more positively. And, you know, I didn't really necessarily look at it as when you do choice based, sometimes that does put a student in I don't know what to do. You know, I've seen it in adults. I've honestly even seen it in art teachers in a workshop. When I first started, I thought, who am I to do a workshop? So I thought, well, you know, we'll kind of go free for all. And that sometimes didn't fly with someone.
That's great.
Here is another. I've tried freedom options and the students doubt their abilities to be self-choosing the concepts and selecting their media. They hesitate, risk trying something new without teacher demonstration instructions of specific criteria. My solution is to give them a few must-haves to help them start their creativity. I think that's fantastic because when you do give somebody sort of a little demonstration, and I just did a workshop at my church for some ladies, and we were collaging, which to me, that is a free for all. But I gave them an idea of, you know, pick sort of what you want to put down on the paper, decide what is going to go on there. And then from there, you can have some freedom in where you place it and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think that's a great idea. And Mary, I'll let you speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that because I've been observing carefully. Bridget Cutterly, some of you might know her. She's an elementary art teacher in Sun Prairie, and she's done a lot of work with TAB in her classroom. She's probably the most advanced teacher that has been doing it the longest. And so what June just posted in the chat there about the must-haves, I think that's a scaffolding. That it sounds like the exact right thing to do. You observed what students are struggling with, and then you come in with a solution, like try this instead. Try these, more teacher-directed process, and just so that they can gain confidence, like you said. And I feel like, I think that I definitely have seen tab teachers give constraints to certain students who need it. So the students who need the constraints, it's more individualized. And so they're able to work with those students over time. It's always an evolution. It's a slow build. So that's good teaching practice. I find that would be, if I were in a pure tab classroom, I just managing 25 children all in different, to me, you also have to choose a level of freedom and constraint that you can handle. So yeah, so finding that balance. And I think with just watching Bridget teach, she has so many constraints in student behavior so that they can operate independently in the classroom. Because as those of you who've used the tab model, students need to be able to go and get all their paint set up and clean up all by themselves. So there's a lot of constraints around how to do that stuff. That's very teacher directed. But then as far as what students make, it's all up to them. But I see that from June's comment there that, she's really thinking about it's freedom and constraint. God, okay, these students need more constraint. And so I think also thinking about, you might be able to handle a lot looser, more open-ended thing, and you would be excited to do that as an artist. Some people are scared to enter into something where they can do whatever they want. That can be, then they rely on kitsch and trite things that they already know how to do.
Right. Another comment from Carrie, I used to teach tab to elementary and middle school students using centers and free choice units. This year I went to high school and my school uses a career readiness model, and I'm trying to figure out how to bring more choice back to my students within this constraint.
Yeah. That's an exciting problem for you to solve. Yeah, I mean, hopefully this lens of freedom and constraint is helpful. And if there's a focus on career readiness, I mean, if you think about art careers, designers have many more constraints than studio artists generally. If you think about a client who says, I want only these colors and this font, and you have to work within those constraints, that's a real world problem to solve. Those are real world constraints. And well, then the problem is, how do I be creative within those constraints? And it's possible. It's possible. My husband's a graphic designer, and after 17 years of working with the same stuff, it gets a little boring, but that's the challenge is figuring out. And any kind of design problem, I think has built-in constraints. So taking a design education perspective might be an interesting place to explore for your new position at the high school.
I think too, it's a perfect opportunity to sort of utilize this information that we just got today and have that conversation with your students too. As you think about career readiness, there are some businesses that are going to have a lot more constraints, and some that are going to have a lot more, are a little bit more loose and have a little bit more freedom. And how do you see yourself fitting in, and having students assess themselves? I love the fact that the art room really does teach students to be career ready. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir, in this webinar. You can only hope that maybe somebody's, principal or, superintendent watches, but there's truth, because there's the time management and the use of tools and, all of those social emotional learning skills that are career ready stuff. You joke that everything I learned to do in life, I learned in the art room. There's a lot of truth to that. You guys teach a lot of life skills. Failure, how to accept failure and to grow from it and move on from it. Another question that came up says, when I first introduced TAB to my students, I was very transparent about what the goals of TAB are. We spoke explicitly about embracing ambiguity. I have given options to get inspiration, look at books, artworks. Sorry, I'm laughing because my computer's way further away than it appears. I have given options to get inspiration, look at books, artwork examples, watch classmates. There is also merit in playing with the materials and letting the materials and letting speak to you. So true. I also just want to share too, as somebody that liked art, but when I first started working at Nasco, I didn't consider myself an artist. I had a brother, you know, and I was an adult, but still my brain went somehow back to being 12 years old. And my brother, Rob, could draw your face. Like he had sort of that God-given talent. And then with the help of amazing art teachers, he was this amazing artist. And so I didn't think I was an artist because of that. I started working at Nasco because who doesn't want to sell, you know, crayons, paints, and markers? That just sounded fun. And then I met art teachers who were like, absolutely, you're an artist. You can do this. And then I started learning. But when you talk about artists copying other artists and I see every time a teacher demonstrates, often the student copies the teacher. There's just so much truth to when you're sort of learning on your own like that. You do tend to either copy someone or you stay in what you feel safe because you don't want to fail. I'm lucky as an adult that, you know, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? I wreck it, you know, I'll just buy more stuff and try it again. But yeah, that's interesting stuff for sure.
Yeah, and that was posted by Monica. Hi, Monica. Monica's one of our cooperating teachers, and I think that's you know, those are really key pieces in an art education is experimenting. And often I definitely think at the elementary level, we have it's always a limit of time. So we just want kids to get started on this thing that we've planned. But and sometimes just giving kids materials and say, well, see what you can do with it. Sometimes they need a little prompt. And then they need help with, okay, now that we've done this experimentation, how will we take what we learned and apply it to the next thing? Because that's the goal of experimentation, is to discover something new and then use it to apply in another context. So, but yeah, that can be so freeing to some kids. And I do think that, you know, when you ask the question, why are we interested in more choice in the art room now? I think I started to see this when there was all the conversation about Common Core. And the art teachers are like, oh God, are we going to get a Common Core curriculum too? That's, you know, all the focus on standards, that I think art teachers freaked out a little bit. Like, oh my God, we have to be the last bastion of choice in the curriculum because the kids aren't getting choice anywhere else. So I don't know how true all of that is, but I understand that is one of our functions in the school, is to give students some space to discover something new, the experimentation, and to find out what they want to say, something meaningful in their own work. So it's just so many goals in the work that we do. But I think it's a helpful question to think, well, how are we different than the other subject areas, and really play it up? Because if they're not getting it anywhere else.
True. The other question that I sort of wondered is, has the pandemic created the need to be teacher directed because you sort of need some order, you sort of need some structure again? Or has it created choice because of the constraints that did happen? Now, granted, when you got sent home and all of a sudden you were an art teacher who were dealing with children to teach art and only the supplies they could cobble up from their own home, that definitely was a pretty fast lesson in choice. But I'm curious how that has made a difference.
Yeah, I would love to hear from people listening if they have a response to that of, let's see.
Yep, I thought the pandemic created more opportunity for choice. We didn't know what materials kids had available, so it demanded choice and ingenuity. Yeah, it sure did. And some of the posts that you saw on social media
Mhm.
were amazing. Lynn, I do love your themes of love, peace, and recycle. And then kids get to pick what they do in the studio. That is very cool. I just wonder if some, can you have two different styles in terms of meeting the students' needs? Like I look at my own grandchildren within one family, and one of the children are very like, he wants to follow, Art Kids for Hub on, I'm probably saying that wrong, but a video where they tell him what to do and he's good at it. And then he learns and then he can freehand it. But then the other one, she's watching the video and she ends up with this abstract piece of art because she's not, she wants to go her own way. So I wonder if teachers can give a little bit of like, nope, you need a little bit more constraint. And, here's how you free that up a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's so true. There's every model of teaching and art education has strengths, and then it has trade-offs, and it's true for different students. Because I had the same situation. I have a niece and nephew who both went to a Montessori school, and my niece thrived, and my nephew it was not a good result. He needed something different. And so I don't know, thinking about a tab classroom or thinking about a more teacher-directed classroom, what works for the majority of students. I think we are always differentiating. We always, no matter what model you embrace, you're going to have to respond to individual student needs for sure. And maybe that's the lens of constraint and freedom there. If looking at a student's, observing what they're doing and discerning, do I need to impose some constraints here so that the student can thrive, or do I need to provide more freedom for them to thrive? And so that lens might be useful in individual situations too.
Absolutely. We had a comment from Letitia, which I just am going to say, Letitia for the win. I learned to plan ahead before we had shutdown during this new school year. Now I send home paper with students, and about 2 weeks later, school closed due to the freezing dangerous temperature and severe snowfall. So now you are ready. So cool. Somebody else, Lynn also says on Facebook this year, many are struggling with apathy and rejection of teacher direction. And so many are switching to tab. Yeah, and that hurts my heart for all of you guys, because I think that's probably not anything to do with any of you as a teacher, as much as it is just trying to learn how to behave in that environment, especially for the younger ones that have not had any training prior for the last 2 years. Kindergartners have been, started on Zoom and are now in class for the first time. So yeah, that is really, really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to ask yourself too, that with the guiding questions I posted is, if you are considering tab, why? What's driving it? For me, the reason it's interesting to me is because I think certain models of art ed, they don't really reflect the idea generation that artists need to engage in. So if the teacher comes up with the project and then the students just implement it, you've cut off at least half of the creative process. So to me, to be more true to how artists work, more choice I think is a good idea. But I also know the constraints of a classroom with 25, 30 kids. And so there's certain decisions that, and if any of you have read Olivia Goody's articles, she would say that, the ideal is that every student can function independently as a studio artist, but so many kids, there's just so much more structure they need and practice, and they need a guide, the teacher to guide them in order to take advantage of an open studio. That so balancing that is just really, I think, really something that all of us have to work through, and what's going to work. But really examining, why am I interested in this? Is it pedagogical? Is it about classroom management? Which is the quote, the post there is like, in some ways, if you're only doing it because the lack of student engagement, I have also seen students not engaged in tab classrooms. So I don't think that's going to solve the problems. I don't know. I mean, I have definitely seen in my observations, there is definitely student apathy. It's not universal, but it's more so than it has been in the past. So that everybody's scratching their head about what are we going to do here?
Absolutely. I am putting my email address in, and Mary, will you post the slides?
Yes, I have them right here. Oops, just a second.
I was ready for tab and wrote a grant. Oops, all of a sudden it skipped on me. It was ready, a grant to get started. COVID slammed it. Now I'm doing it gradually to meet kids where they are. Lynn, actually sounds smart. I want to use this for advanced students that are mixed with students that barely work. The advanced work hard and finish before everyone. There's some truth to that. When you raise the bar, everybody raises too. Thank you for putting the post in there.
Yeah, and I would just encourage people to, if you feel like your curriculum is too constrained, then try it in small doses. Like, what happens if I'm still going to teach watercolor techniques, but then I'm going to give students 3 choice options for subject matter. Like, just like the person who posted, these are the themes I wanted my students to explore, to choose one of the themes. Because sometimes a big idea or a theme is also a constraint that can result in new ideas that a student may never have thought to make a work of art about a childhood memory until you presented that. Lots of artists explore their childhood memories in their artwork. So yeah, I think.
Well, my goodness, we were worried that we might not have enough time or engagement to fill up an hour, and we are definitely past that. I like the idea of painting in small groups. You guys, thank you so much for your comments. If you have more comments, by all means, feel free to email myself. Dr. Mary certainly has given you her email, and she's willing to chat with you and share her knowledge, which is clearly vast and impressive. Next month is a little bit more of a lesson plan. We're going to go over an engraving with oil pastels and tempera paint. And so we have a guest host, and we also have a featured art teacher, Andrea Worthy from Wisconsin. So I'm super excited about that. Lots of thank yous coming for you, Dr. Mary. I appreciate your time and all the work you're doing. And I really, really appreciate that you are nurturing and growing more art educators, because y'all are the most amazing humans in this whole wide world. So stay strong and healthy and happy, and just know that you are all making a giant difference. And we will see you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Chris.